Hey sophomores, so you are currently watching the background lecture video for Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. We are moving into our last book for the, hang on, I just wanted to, sorry, I wanted to fix my hair. Okay, sorry, my bangs bother me. It happens, it's still, I have like random baby hairs, okay. I'm just gonna keep filming this. I'm not gonna stop it. I'm gonna keep going. Anyways, so this is the last book for the year, and honestly, it's a really great play. There's also a musical adapted from it called My Fair Lady, and if you like musicals, you should totally watch it. It's one of my favorite musicals. I didn't actually even know that it was from this play, and so I was pretty stoked last year when I first taught it. And so yeah, we're gonna go through the background so that you understand the author, historical context, a quick overview of the play. That way you're not super confused as we start reading together. So let us go ahead and get started. I'm going to move this way and get comfortable. Oh, you just saw my PJ pants. Okay, so let us go. All right. Our playwright, George Bernard Shaw, born in 1856. You don't really need to know too much about his biography per se, but there are a couple of important points that you kind of want to be mindful of. One is that he grew up in an atmosphere of what's considered genteel poverty. And what genteel poverty is, it's a term to describe those who suffered a significant loss of power and influence, yet they don't necessarily live in poverty. And for him, this loss of power and influence is actually much more humiliating than simply being poor. And it really affected kind of his mindset, his perspective, and of course, ultimately his writings. Another kind of important point that affected his writing is that in 1872, his mother left her husband with her two daughters to follow her music teacher and live with him, which, as you know, is quite scandalous considering especially the Victorian society. We're still kind of on the last end of that time period. And however we may feel about her actions, essentially what we realize is that it shows him to be very close to an exceptionally independent woman. A woman who, for whatever reason, did not really care about others in terms of she was able to make her own decision, and she was independent, and she was very strong-willed. And you definitely see that in his characters, particularly in Pygmalion, in Eliza Doolittle and Mrs. Higgins, and also the mother of Henry Higgins, Mrs. Higgins. You see that in those female characters. He has very strong female characters. Moving on to the next slide. And so he started his early writing career actually in 1876, where he followed his mom and older sister to London. However, he didn't really have the greatest of success. He struggled a lot. He kind of suffered continuous poverty and a lot of frustration because of that poverty. He really depended upon his mother's pound a week from her husband. And so I guess that also affected his writing as well. I mean, and not only that, I think in general, being in your 20s and struggling as a writer and facing failure and all of that really allows a person to find themselves, which isn't a surprise. And so during this decade, he really found himself. He was a vegetarian. He became a socialist, which is anti-communist. I think you've learned that already in your world history class. I think you're on world history now, I hope. Dang it. Sorry, my Siri heard me. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna go move back. But he became a socialist, essentially believing the idea that society should be owned and regulated by all people, not by a government or a small amount of people, all people. He was a very skilled orator and tentatively started becoming a playwright. Before long, he became one of the most sought after public speakers in England. And in his pamphlets, in his, orations, he argued in favor of equality of income. He advocated the equitable division of land and capital and believed that property was essentially theft and that capitalism was deeply flawed and unlikely to last. It was bound to fail, which I find interesting just because we actually see the same ideas and viewpoints from some politicians today. So it's, history repeats itself. There's nothing, I don't know. I thought that was kind of cool. I literally thought of that while I was going through this lecture. He, although a socialist, didn't necessarily feel that you should reform immediately. You shouldn't rise up and fight. He was really all about peaceful reform, gradual reform, essentially reform through education and through the fine arts and plays and writing. And so there we see Alfred Doolittle, a common dustman in Pygmalion, who really showcases Shaw's viewpoints and his message and how he views life kind of should be. And so he tells us, essentially, he makes it very clear, I must warn my readers that my attacks are directed against themselves, not against my stage figures. He makes it very clear that his writing is purposeful and it's meant to be an attack for us to address our issues and to allow us to realize and reform. And his thoughts on Pygmalion itself, he really wanted to force his viewers to face the reality of unpleasant events. And he promotes his unpleasant plays, because a lot of his plays are unpleasant, by publishing a very long preface in which he could argue his views. And so in Pygmalion, I do recommend you read the preface. Please don't skip over into some prefaces. They're always, always very important. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize eventually for his literature in 1925, and he really continued to write until he was 94, which is like 70 years. 70, that's a long time of writing. It's pretty impressive. And so Pygmalion is also named after 1, a play, 2, a myth, and 3, a psychological, I guess, figure idea called the Pygmalion effect, also known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you haven't heard this before, you'll hear it at some point, especially if you take psychology, and I think many of you will, maybe in college or in high school or wherever, or maybe you already have. But what it is, essentially, what we believe about ourselves will influence how we behave, right? And how we behave often impacts how people think about us. So for example, let's consider me as an example. I always felt that I wasn't very good at math. And because I wasn't good at math, I just really didn't try very hard in my math classes. And because I didn't try really hard, maybe my teachers saw that and really didn't expect much of me as a math student. And so how we behave impacts how how I behave impact how my math teacher thought of me. And in turn, how, she thought of me also affected how she behaved towards me. Maybe she didn't really think much of me, or he. I had a lot of math teachers. And in turn, their behavior affects how we view ourselves. And then you start to see this cycle. And oftentimes, it's a very vicious cycle. So this idea of how we feel about ourselves is how we behave, which in turn affects how people view us, which in turn affects how they behave towards us, which also finally in turn affects how we ultimately view ourselves and reaffirms and self-fulfills everything. And so oftentimes if you view yourself as a failure and then you keep that kind of idea going, you'll re-fulfill that prophecy. Does that make sense? And it could also be a positive thing, like you view yourself as a success, like you think you can, you can, and people have faith in you and they treat you that way, and then you're like, yeah, I'm great. So it can be a positive thing as well, but also more often than not, it can be a negative thing. And so Pygmalion effect comes from the myth Pygmalion. It's a Greek myth written by Ovid. And so the essential idea of the actual myth itself is one, George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion's based off of this myth, loosely based off of this myth. There's never any actual reference to the Greek myth. My words are getting all jumbled together. Shaw assumes that his audience is familiar with the myth. Essentially, the myth is about a Greek sculptor named Pygmalion who essentially hates all women, thinks they are terrible, he abhors them, he wishes to be celibate and unmarried forever and ever and ever and ever, and one day he sculpts a woman, the perfect woman, and he quite literally falls in love with his sculpture. She's perfect, he falls in love with her, and on the feast day of Venus, or some celebratory day for Venus, he wishes and dreams and hopes that Venus would maybe grant his wish and find him a woman who is like his statue. However, deep down he thinks, I want my statue to come to life. But he's not sure that she would actually grant that wish, so he tries to rephrase it and go, I want someone like my statue. She knows better, and she actually brings his statue, his vision to life. She literally like turns his statue and she becomes a human being, and she wakes up as his perfect woman, like his actual vision. And she wakes up in the arms of Pygmalion. And so, which, okay, if you think about it, is if you read the myth, it's actually kind of creepy. It is. But we'll disregard the creepiness, and so don't worry about that too much. But the general idea of, I guess, George Bernard Shaw's play is, I guess, what happens afterwards? You know, what are the actual statue's thoughts? How does she feel once she has become this perfect creation in this mind of a man, right? Does she have her own feelings? Does she have her own thoughts, her attitude? Is there a happily ever after? And you see that. And so I would say Pygmalion, the play, is almost like a sequel, you know, like a tangent, kind of like White Sargasso Sea with Jane Eyre. It's like another perspective. And this time it's the statue's perspective. So kind of cool things there. So a quick overview of the play itself, so you know what it's about. 1, it's a romantic comedy, but also social criticism. 2, the background, it's set in London, England in the early 1900s. 3, here's a quick overview. So in this play, George Bernard Shaw essentially uses humor and very lively characterization, especially in Eliza Doolittle and Henry Higgins and Eliza's father, all of that. But he really explores how language, class structure, education, and gender roles affect how people are seen by society. So Eliza Doolittle, who is our main character, she is poor, but she's really proud. She speaks in a Cockney accent, which showcases her lack of education. She's also female and very much poor working class, and how she's viewed by other people. Versus Henry Higgins on the other end, he is male, he is higher class, he is educated and speaks well, he's arrogant, he is a professor, so and so he's viewed in a certain way as well. So these are our two main characters. And essentially Eliza goes to Henry Higgins' house and she asks him and requests of him, you know, teach me how to speak properly. And teach me how to lose my accent so that I can have a proper job in a flower shop versus selling flowers on the street. And so it's really about her effort to move from one social class to somewhere higher. And he goes a step further, actually. He decides to take her on as a professional challenge. He takes a bet. If you've ever watched She's All That, it's a 1990s like teen American rom-com with Freddie Prinze Jr. and what's her name? Rachel something, I think. No, I don't know I forgot what her name was. It's a pretty good actually movie, PG-13, so please be 13 if you're watching it. But it's kind of based off of this. But essentially, he takes a bet with his friend Colonel Pickering. He says, you know what? In 6 months, I can pass her off as a duchess. Not just a flower girl in a shop, but a duchess. She will act in a way where people will assume that she's a duchess. And so here you see this idea of appearance versus reality. So he moves her into his home, and with the help of his friend Colonel Pickering, his housekeeper, he teaches her not only proper speech, but proper manners of the upper class. And she wants to learn, but there's also tension just because he treats her terribly. Like, because she's female and she's a lower class, he treats her like an object, like a project. He's so mean to her. Like, he's so mean to her. And so there is this tension throughout the entirety of how they treat each other, because she just wants to be treated as an equal, you know, as an actual person with feelings. So some of the main questions that we kind of arise and we think of is, 1, will they have a relationship and become friends, or will the differences drive them apart? If his experiment succeeds, if he's able to transform her outward appearance, well, where does she go? What are her opportunities as a woman, as a single young woman? And so here we go into gender roles and equality and feminism, but where does she go from there? And even though she speaks like a duchess and maybe looks like one and acts like one, will she be able to live like one? So just because you're able to provide this fake persona, does that really mean that's who you are? And essentially that leads us into, what does she give up in order to move from working class to upper class? And there's this idea of identity that goes into play. There's so many beautiful thematic ideas. So speaking of theme and major conflicts, moving on to the next couple of slides, I'm not going to really read all this word for word. This PowerPoint's available for you to view, so I just will kind of touch base on a couple of things. You have class status and social class and status divide. They do have class structures. You have your upper class, your middle class, and your lower class. Considering, you know, the vast gulf between, you know, the poor and also even lower upper class. This, like, Eliza at one point believes that riding in a taxi is like the ultimate badge of upper class quality of life. And that's really important. Keep that in mind from the beginning, this idea of riding in a taxi and also the end of the play. And so being mindful of the class divide. Not only that, gender relations differences. Males and females speak very differently to each other, not just between classes, but within the same class. Like Mr. Higgins and his own mother, Mrs. Higgins, although they're in the same class, how do they speak to each other? Also, Colonel Pickering, Henry Higgins, as men, really have no idea what they're doing with Eliza and the situation that they put her into. And they're very clueless and really insensitive, actually, thinking about, like, we're just going to turn her into a duchess and not worry about her afterwards. And that becomes problematic later on. And so Mrs. Pierce recognizes Henry Higgins as kind of immoral. And so she kind of, you know, acknowledges that, and you see that in her dialogue. Self-consciousness and self-perception. Eliza, especially Eliza's self-worth. Essentially, she learns that women in upper class don't really have the independence that women in the lower class do. That when you are in the upper class, there's almost this, like, birdcage, I guess you could say, that you're put into. Consider Jane Eyre, right? When she moves into a higher class with, you know, Rochester, what happens to her? Does she really have freedom? You know, and so she realizes that, like, as a woman in lower class, you actually have this general freedom of how you can act and where you can go. But in the upper class, you really only have so many options, you know? And so there's a lot of this idea of self-identity and self-worth and where she belongs and where she wants to be. And so kind of thinking about all of that. And there's a lot of all of this stuff. And then finally, well, not finally, there's actually so much more, but social snobbery. You know, she struggles because she wants to, she originally sells flowers on the street, but she wants to work at a flower shop. And she essentially at one point is affected by social snobbery herself when she kind of looks down on those who sell street flowers in her kind of her older profession. And she really discovers that, like, a rise in culture really means also a loss of independence, as does her stepmother. She eventually achieves independence, but the most important conflict in the play is the idea that the class system is Eliza's primary antagonist. It's not Henry Higgins, it's not the other women, but the class system itself in terms of her struggle navigating it. And so, yeah, there's a lot. I know, it's really deep. A lot deeper than you expect. But we'll talk about it, hopefully, as we read the play. And I really hope you like it. It's really good. We'll be watching clips of maybe the musical, clips of the play itself. There's an audiobook version that you can listen to. And so there's all these variations that will make Pygmalion very much enjoyable for you. So that's basically it. And if you have any questions, you can, of course, email me, Microsoft Team chat me, you know the drill. I guess I'll move over here to end my video. I've kept it under 20 minutes. Maybe it'll be even shorter once I do a couple edits here and there. Okay, so that's it. Have a great day. I hope you watched this entire thing and you didn't skip through it. Thanks to my #1 fans out there who are watching all of it. Okay, goodbye.